All right, this is section 8.1, changes in Russia. When Russia entered World War I, it was totally unprepared, just like Germany thought. Its military leaders were weak, and its factories could not make enough weapons and supplies. In the first years of the war, more than 2 million Russian soldiers were killed. Tsar Nicholas II, the Russian monarch, that's like their king, the Tsar, went to the battlefront. Nicholas thought it would help if he personally led the troops. He left his wife, Alexandra, in charge of the government while he was gone. By March 1917, the Russian people were angry. Millions of soldiers were dying in the war. At home, there were food and fuel shortages. The government had started rationing bread or limiting the amount that people could buy. Led by working class women, angry workers went on strike. Remember the March on Versailles that we studied in the French Revolution? It was led by women, and it had to do with bread lines, right? So this is maybe a trend in history that we could look at. Thousands marched through the streets of Petrograd, Russia, yelling, "Bread, bread." Alexandra wrote to Nicholas at the battlefront and told him what was going on. She told him, "This is a hooligan movement. Young people run around and shout that there is no bread, simply to create excitement. If the weather were very cold, they would all probably stay at home." The Tsar ordered troops to stop the protests by shooting into the crowd if necessary. But the soldiers refused to follow his orders. Many joined the demonstrators. The Tsar had lost his power. Nicholas was forced to step down as the Tsar of Russia. Russia's temporary government decided to stay in World War I to protect its honor. People were not happy with this decision. They were tired of fighting, starving, and suffering. Groups called Soviets formed across the country in towns and rural areas. The Soviets were local councils made up of workers, peasants, and soldiers who wanted change. Some of the Soviets had more power in their areas than the temporary government. A political party called the Bolsheviks became powerful by gaining the support of Soviets around the country. Under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks promised an end to the war. They also said that land would be given to the peasants. Their slogans were peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks overthrew the temporary government and seized power. Soon, they renamed themselves the Communists. Not everyone was happy with the Communists. A civil war broke out in Russia. However, by 1921, the Communists had total control of Russia. Lenin organized Russia into several self-governing republics that all answered to the central government in Moscow. In 1922, the country was named the Union of Soviet It was renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. Now, here are our questions. Question 1 says, Russia was totally unprepared to enter, and we remember back that was World War I. Okay. The next question is, by March 1917, the Russian people were angry because, well, it was all of these, okay? Millions of soldiers were dying or had died. There were fuel shortages, and the government had started rationing bread. None of these were things that people could stand. They just couldn't stand it anymore. So it was all of the above. Tsar Nicholas II was the leader of Russia, and he was forced to step down. So that is A, Nicholas II. Bolsheviks renamed themselves the Communists. Okay. And there's actually some discussion on that and what Bolshevik means. And there were actually two different groups of competing sort of communists. There were the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and the Bolsheviks kind of won out. The Mensheviks were considered like not, I'm not going to say this right, like not extreme enough. And so the Bolsheviks sort of overpowered them in that political change. Doesn't really matter for our purposes. In 1922, Russia was named C, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We're going to move on to the crossword down here. So we're going to start with 2 across. Many soldiers who had been sent to stop the protests joined the demonstrators. Excuse me. By 1921, the blank had total control of Russia. It was the communists. The communists took over Russia. But before they were called the communists, they were the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks had overthrown the temporary government and seized power. Tsar Nicholas's wife, her name was Alexandra, wrote that the protests in Petrograd were a, quote, hooligan movement. After the communists seized power, or as the communists seized power, Russia entered a civil war. This civil war is, according to Russians of the time, it was exactly the rising up of the proletariat that Karl Marx had predicted. If we remember back when we talked about social change during the Industrial Revolution and how Marxism and Marxist communism sort of came about, we talked about how there had always been sort of according to Marx, there had always been sort of a class struggle between the workers and the factory owners, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. Well, according to the Bolsheviks, this was that war. This civil war was that war. It was a war where the workers took over their country. Before the Bolsheviks, and I don't like how these questions are out of order, but before the Bolsheviks took over Russia, the temporary government had stayed in World War I. Once the Bolsheviks took power, Russia left World War I. They were tired of fighting. They were tired of young, poor men being sent to the front lines to die when they were needed to be productive in their society. One of the Bolshevik slogans was peace, land, bread. So it was their aim to leave World War II. I'm sorry, leave World War I. It was their aim to stay out of World War II until they couldn't. All right. Blank the second thought it would help if he personally led the troops to battle. This was Tsar Nicholas II, the former monarch of Russia. Some blank had more power in their areas than the temporary government. These were the Soviets. Soviets are, there are a lot of different ways. There were a lot of different ways that you can describe Soviets, but one way of looking at them is they're a lot like a really powerful labor union. So it's a group of workers who get together and decide what sort of rules or laws they want in their towns or in their factories. And so in a lot of ways, it's similar to sort of an extreme labor union. And then over time, that sort of evolved into something else. Blank was the leader of the Bolsheviks. His name was Lenin. His name was Lenin, V.I. Lenin, or Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. We just call him Lenin. All right. The next thing we're going to do, we're going to look at the map. And the first question asks, name 2 countries that border the USSR. Okay, I will take questions at the end, but I will absolutely address them. 2 countries that border the USSR. You can go ahead and write your question in the chat if you'd like. 2 countries that border the USSR. So here's the USSR. It is all of this shaded area, right? And so you could name Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India, China, Mongolia, Manchuria, Korea, right? Any of those would work, even India maybe. I might have said Afghanistan. So those are all countries that border the USSR. 2 countries that were part of the Russian Empire, but not part of the USSR. So this is sort of interesting. The Russian Empire it formerly included Finland. Okay, when Russia had a Tsar and they were an empire. It included Finland. It included Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Poland. But when it reorganized as the USSR, it did not include those areas. Those areas did not become socialist republics, at least not initially. One body of water that borders the USSR, where there are many. You can start left to right. So first we have the Black Sea here. We have the Caspian Sea. You could, I guess, say the Aral Sea. And you go over here, you've got the Sea of Okhotsk. I suppose it would be enough to just say that's part of the Pacific Ocean. And then you have the Arctic Ocean, which actually parts of the United States border Russia across this Arctic Ocean. So they're a neighbor of ours in that way, and our neighbor to the north, the far north. On the other side of Canada is just Russia, okay, after Santa Claus. All right, the extension questions I did not get into, but I will read them to you. Question 1, while running the Russian government, Alexandra, that is the Tsar's wife, the Tsarina, she was called, she depended on a man named Grigory Rasputin to advise her. A group of nobles killed Rasputin in 1916 because they were afraid he was taking too much control over Russia. What was unusual about Rasputin's death? Look in your textbook, on the internet, or the library to find out. Everything about Rasputin is unusual and strange. If you want to look at a strange character in history, he's almost mythological in his strangeness. He seems like the evil character in a fairy tale. He really is a strange person in history. So it's really worth looking into if you want to understand who was running Russia and who they were listening to at the time. Later, after the Bolsheviks took charge, Nicholas II and his family were executed. For about 65 years after this execution, a woman named Anna Anderson said she was the Tsar's daughter, Anastasia, and that she had escaped before the assassins could kill her. Was she telling the truth? I think the more interesting part of this question is why the Bolsheviks decided to kill Nicholas and his many children. It's an incredibly gory story, but at the same time, it's really interesting that was the solution that the communists decided on. They thought, it's not enough to just depose the king. We have to wipe out his entire bloodline. And that was, it was a really extreme moment in history. Question 3 says, do you think the troops who refused to stop the protests in Petrograd did the right thing? Is following orders always the right thing to do? I hope that the answer to this question is obvious to you. If I have been a good history teacher to you at all this year, you know what answer I think would be good for that, but maybe you have your own opinion. Okay, so this is changes in Russia. Now, the reason we need to learn about the Russian Revolution is because it tells us part of the reason why World War I ended the way that it did. As the Bolsheviks took charge of Russia, they left World War I, and because they left, it sort of left France and Britain in a really precarious spot against the Axis powers, against Germany and Austria, and it actually inspired the United States to enter the war. So these changes in Russia, though, that is not the end of their impact in history. We will see how these changes actually impact World War II and the beginnings of World War II as we go forward.